blood freezing on his eyelashes, was the first sign Caleb Reed had minutes left to live. Trapped hundreds of miles deep in the Alaskan Brooks Range, surrounded by shattered aluminum and howling silence, he faced an impossible ultimatum: engineer a thermal bunker out of solid ice, or become a permanent frozen fixture of the desolate tundra. Shattered fiberglass and aviation fuel scented the bitter air. 30 minutes earlier, Caleb had been casually reviewing topographic maps in the passenger seat of a Cessna 185 Skywagon. He was a senior surveyor for Apex Geological Charting remote mineral deposits near the Arctic Circle. Now he was hanging upside down by his seatbelt, his head throbbing with a concussive rhythm that perfectly matched his racing pulse. Metal groaned in the wind. The plane had been swatted from the sky by a sudden, violent katabatic downdraft, a localized gravity wind that had rushed down the jagged slopes of the Arrogate Peaks like an invisible avalanche. Caleb fumbled with the buckle. His fingers, already stiffening in his heavy leather gloves, felt like wooden pegs. With a harsh click, the harness released, and he dropped unceremoniously into the crushed ceiling of the overturned cabin. Snow was already blasting through the shattered windshield, accumulating in small, powdery drifts on the instrument panel. "Donovan?" Caleb croaked, his voice raw from the impact. Donovan Finch, the veteran bush pilot who had flown these hostile routes for 20 years, didn't answer. He was slumped against the yoke, a terrible stillness to his posture. Caleb crawled over the twisted metal, reaching out to check the pilot's pulse. The skin of Donovan's neck was already cold. The impact had been instantaneous and unforgiving. Grief threatened to anchor Caleb to the floor of the cabin, but a sudden, violent shiver snapped his focus back to reality. Survival experts call it the golden hour. In extreme Arctic conditions, a human being has approximately 60 minutes to secure shelter and fire before hypothermia systematically shuts down their cognitive functions. Caleb kicked his way out of the mangled door frame, tumbling into a world devoid of color. Everything was stark white and shadow gray. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, but the relentless wind dropping off the peaks brought the wind chill down to a flesh-destroying 40 degrees. He had to move. Returning to the fuselage, Caleb initiated a desperate systematic scavenge. The emergency locator transmitter ELT on the tail was completely destroyed, its casing smashed against a granite boulder during the slide. No rescue beacon would be transmitting his coordinates to Elmendorf Air Force Base. He was entirely off the grid. He managed to pry open the rear cargo hold. Inside, he found a fractured survival kit, 3 frozen high-calorie protein bars, a standard flare gun with 2 charges, a folding aluminum snow saw, and a heavy-duty Mylar space blanket. His surveying equipment, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, was now completely useless, a cruel joke in the face of imminent freezing. Caleb's first instinct was to use the aluminum shell of the Cessna as a makeshift shelter. He huddled inside the cabin for 10 minutes, but the twisted metal acted as a catastrophic wind tunnel. The conductive nature of the aluminum was literally sucking the heat from his body. If he stayed in the wreckage, he would be dead before midnight. Looking out through the swirling whiteout, his eyes locked onto a massive compacted snowdrift piled against a steep rock escarpment about 50 yards away. It was leeward, shielded from the worst of the prevailing winds. A memory flared in his mind. Years ago, during his training in the Yukon, an old First Nations trapper named Harrison Caldwell had taught him the mechanics of a sub-zero survival shelter. Not a simple snow cave which could collapse, and not a traditional igloo which required specific architectural snow conditions. Caldwell had taught him how to build a thermal ice bunker, a hybridized structure designed to withstand apocalyptic temperature drops by utilizing glazed ice walls to reflect radiant body heat. "Snow is a blanket," Harrison had told him over a crackling fire. "But ice is a mirror. If you build it right, it'll reflect your life right back at you. Caleb grabbed the folding snowsaw, stuffed the meager supplies into his parka, and took one last look at Donovan. He promised the old pilot he would send a recovery team. Then, leaning heavily against the gale, he began the agonizing 50-yard march toward the snowdrift. Every step through the thigh-deep powder felt like moving through wet concrete. By the time he reached the rock face, his lungs were burning, and the sun was already beginning its premature dip below the horizon. The true dark was coming, and with it, the fatal plunge in temperature. Digging the bunker was a deadly balancing act. Caleb had to excavate hundreds of pounds of compacted snow, yet he could not allow himself to sweat. In the Arctic, moisture is a death sentence. If his base layers became damp with perspiration, the water would freeze against his skin the moment he stopped moving, accelerating hypothermia exponentially. He forced himself into a methodical, grueling rhythm. Cut a block with the saw. Pull it out. Stack it aside. Breathe. He stripped off his heavy outer parka, working only in his fleece mid-layer, despite the biting cold. The snowbank was dense, hardened by weeks of relentless wind. He carved a narrow entrance, just wide enough to squeeze his shoulders through, then angled the tunnel slightly upward, before hollowing out the main chamber. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. By elevating the main living quarters above the entrance tunnel, he was engineering a cold well, a trap that would capture the freezing air entering from outside and keep it pooling below his sleeping platform. For 3 agonizing hours, the only sounds in the world were his ragged breathing and the rhythmic shh of the aluminum saw slicing through the snowpack. His triceps screamed in protest. His fingers were stiff, the early stages of frost nip, turning his knuckles waxy and pale. Once the main chamber was roughly the size of a small domed tent, Caleb crawled inside, dragging his gear behind him. The silence inside the snow cave was profound, heavily muted, and claustrophobic. But it wasn't a thermal bunker yet. It was just a hole in the snow. To survive what was coming, he needed to glaze the interior. Caleb pulled a small, heavy-duty emergency candle from the scavenged survival kit. It wasn't much, but it burned thick and hot with a high-fat wax composition. He sparked a waterproof match with trembling hands and lit the thick wick. Holding the small flame inches from the domed ceiling, he began the painstaking process of glazing. The heat of the candle melted the uppermost millimeter of the snow. As Caleb slowly moved the candle across the dome, the melted water immediately refroze in the ambient freezing temperatures, transforming the porous, powdery snow into a solid, smooth shell of ice. He worked methodically, inch by inch, sealing the walls and the ceiling. The process took over an hour, burning through half of his precious candle, but the results were undeniable. When he finished the interior of the bunker, caught the flickering light of the flame, reflecting it off hundreds of tiny icy facets. This glazed shell served 2 critical purposes. First, it prevented the dome from slowly sublimating and dripping freezing water onto him, as his body heat warmed the air. Second, and more importantly, the ice acted as a thermal mirror. The radiant heat emitted by Caleb's own body, which would normally dissipate into the surrounding snowpack, was now trapped, bouncing off the icy walls and back into the small chamber. Caleb constructed a raised sleeping platform out of packed snow, laying the mylar space blanket down as a moisture barrier. He carefully blocked the lower entrance tunnel with his backpack and a large chunk of snow, leaving only a tiny gap for ventilation. Finally, he sat back on the platform in total darkness. He checked the small thermometer attached to his jacket zipper. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to a lethal 35 degrees. Inside the newly glazed bunker, the ambient temperature was slowly, miraculously creeping up. It hit 10 degrees. then 15 to go off. Eventually powered solely by Caleb's trapped body heat and the residual warmth of the small candle, it stabilized at a manageable 28 bistfas. He was cold, shivering violently in his damp clothes, but he was no longer actively dying. The thermal bunker had worked. Caleb chewed on a rock-hard protein bar, forcing his jaw to break down the frozen oats. Exhaustion crashed over him like a physical weight. He curled into a tight ball on the elevated platform, pulling his parka over his head to trap his breath, and succumbed to a fractured, uneasy sleep. He didn't know how many hours passed in the pitch-black void, but he was violently awakened by a sound that sent pure adrenaline surging through his veins. Crack! It sounded like a rifle shot inside the confined space. Caleb bolted upright, smashing his head against the low, icy ceiling. Crack! Pop! He scrambled for his lighter, his thumb numb and unresponsive. After 3 desperate strikes, the spark caught. The flickering yellow light revealed a nightmare. The glazed ice walls of his bunker were fracturing. Spiderweb cracks were racing across the dome above him, showering him with fine, razor-sharp crystals. Panic seized him. The structure wasn't collapsing from weight, it was shrinking. The physics of extreme cold were taking over. As water freezes into ice, it expands. But when solid ice is subjected to a massive sudden plunge in temperature, a phenomenon known as thermal contraction, it shrinks, violently tearing itself apart. Caleb frantically checked his thermometer. The mercury had vanished into the bulb. It was maxed out at the bottom. The Metdaha 50 freeze had arrived. A massive polar vortex had settled directly over the Brooks Range, dropping the external temperature to a completely unsurvivable. The ambient cold was so aggressive that it was penetrating the thick snowpack, causing the inner ice shell of his bunker to violently contract and shatter under the immense structural tension. But the cracking walls weren't his most immediate threat. As Caleb took a panicked breath, his lungs burned and black spots danced in his vision. The air was thick, heavy, and tasted subtly metallic. His ventilation hole. Caleb lunged toward the entrance tunnel, digging his frozen fingers into the snow block he had used as a door. The moisture from his own breath over the past several hours had traveled toward the only source of external cold, the small air hole, and frozen solid. The tiny vent was completely sealed with an impenetrable plug of solid ice. He was trapped in a shrinking, cracking ice box, and he had just consumed the very last molecules of oxygen in the room. Carbon dioxide poisoning was already shutting down his brain. As Caleb began to claw desperately at the frozen wall, the darkness rushed back in thicker and heavier than before. Desperation became a physical entity, clawing at the inside of Caleb's skull as the heavy metallic taste of carbon dioxide saturated his blood. Every instinct screamed at him to thrash, to punch the freezing walls, to scream for a rescue that wasn't coming. But thrashing required oxygen, and the bunker was utterly devoid of it. Black spots, jagged and pulsating with neon edges, swarmed his peripheral vision. Hypoxia was not a gentle fading into the night. It was a violent, suffocating panic that made his lungs heave uselessly against the toxic air. He dropped his spent lighter. It clattered against the solid ice floor, plunging him back into the abyssal dark, his bare fingers already stiff and waxy, with the onset of frostnip, scrabbled blindly in the pitch blackness for the folding aluminum snow saw. It was buried somewhere in the chaotic folds of his survival gear. He felt the cold metal grabbed the handle and lunged toward the sealed entrance tunnel. The ice plug blocking the ventilation hole was no longer just compacted snow. The moisture from his exhaled breath had frozen it into a crystalline barrier, as dense as solid concrete. Caleb struck it with the serrated edge of the saw. The metal chimed dully, vibrating violently up his arm and sending a shockwave of agony through his elbow joint. The ice didn't even chip. He struck again, and again. His breath came in ragged, useless gasps. His brain felt swollen, pressing painfully against the inside of his skull. The carbon dioxide buildup was rapidly inducing a narcotic confusion. He saw a brief, vivid flash of Donovan the pilot sitting in a diner in Fairbanks, laughing over a cup of black coffee. The hallucination was so incredibly real, Caleb could almost smell the roasted beans and bacon grease, a phantom scent, cutting right through the sterile, freezing air. No. Caleb wheezed, shaking his head violently to dispel the ghost. He gripped the saw with both hands, ignoring the tearing sensation in his freezing skin, and rammed the tip directly into the center of the ice plug with every ounce of his remaining strength. Crack! The plug fractured. A jagged fissure spiderwebbed across the surface. Caleb dropped the saw and drove his heavy insulated boot into the weakened center. The barrier shattered outward. Instantly, the outside world screamed into the bunker. The air that rushed in wasn't a saving grace. It was a weaponized force of nature. The 50 degrees of wind chill blasted through the tiny aperture with the concussive force of a physical blow, carrying with it a spray of microscopic ice crystals that felt like powdered glass against Caleb's exposed skin. He inhaled greedily, filling his starving lungs with oxygen, but the air was so incomprehensibly cold that it triggered a violent spasm in his bronchial tubes. He collapsed onto his side, coughing uncontrollably, each spasm tearing at his chest. Oxygen rapidly returned to his brain, clearing the black spots and the hallucinations, but replacing them with a terrifying reality. The thermal equilibrium of his bunker was destroyed. The radiant heat trapped by the glazed walls was instantly sucked out into the howling vortex of the Brooks Range. Within seconds, the ambient temperature inside the shelter plummeted from a survivable 28 degrees down to a lethal -20. The sudden extreme temperature differential accelerated the thermal contraction of the ice dome. The walls groaned in the dark, a sound exactly like the hull of a submarine crushing under deep ocean pressure. Razor-sharp shards of ice began to peel away from the ceiling, dropping onto Caleb's parka and the mylar blanket. The bunker was quite literally tearing itself apart under the stress of the freeze. Caleb realized he had exchanged suffocation for rapid freezing. He had to plug the hole again, but he couldn't seal it completely. He needed a vent that would exchange air without letting the apocalyptic wind hollow out his shelter. Moving with agonizing slowness, his muscles cramping in the extreme cold, Caleb dragged his heavy canvas backpack toward the breach. His hands were becoming increasingly useless. The digits were turning a pale, sickly gray, the nerve endings screaming before slowly going completely numb. He used his wrists to wedge the backpack into the opening, leaving a narrow, jagged gap at the top, just enough for the toxic carbon dioxide to escape, but small enough to block the brunt of the wind. It was a temporary fix. The cold had already penetrated his bones. He curled back onto the sleeping platform, wrapping the crinkling space blanket tightly around his shoulders. Violent, uncontrollable shivering racked his body, a good sign, ironically, as it meant his core temperature was still high enough to trigger the body's natural heating mechanism. But the shivering consumed massive amounts of caloric energy, and he was running on empty. Hours bled into an indeterminate nightmare. The storm raged outside, a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated through the bedrock and up into his spine. Inside, the temperature stabilized at an agonizing -10 degrees. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind fracturing into disjointed dreams of warm beaches, burning fires, and the heavy mechanical thrum of engines. He was standing in a sunny field, listening to a tractor idly rumbling. The sound grew louder, more rhythmic. a deep, percussive whoomp, whoomp, whoomp that vibrated in his chest. Caleb's eyes snapped open. The darkness was absolute, but the sound was real. It wasn't a tractor. It was the heavy twin-engine beat of a search and rescue helicopter cutting through the howling wind. Adrenaline dormant and nearly depleted flooded his system one final time. He threw off the stiff, frozen mylar blanket. He had to signal them. The emergency beacon was destroyed. They were flying a grid search based solely on Donovan's filed flight plan. In this total whiteout, a buried ice bunker would be completely invisible from the air, blending seamlessly into the vast, frozen dunes of the tundra. He reached blindly for his parka pocket and pulled out the flare gun. It was cold heavy and slick with condensation that had immediately frozen into a thin rime of ice. He checked the breech by feel. One flare loaded, one spare in his pocket. Caleb dragged himself toward the entrance tunnel, pushing the frozen backpack out of the way. The wind immediately blasted his face, blinding him with driven snow. He couldn't fire the flare from inside the bunker. The magnesium projectile would hit the ice ceiling ricochet and incinerate him in a contained inferno. He had to get outside into the storm. Crawling through the narrow, upward-sloping tunnel was the hardest physical task Caleb had ever attempted in his life. His joints felt as though they had been filled with ground glass. His knees banged against the solid ice, leaving deep bruises he couldn't even feel. When he finally breached the surface, the sheer brutality of the 50-degree environment hit him with paralyzing force. The sky was a swirling, chaotic tapestry of charcoal gray and blinding white. The sun was hidden behind a massive wall of low-pressure storm clouds. Snow drove horizontally across the landscape, erasing the horizon and completely burying the wreckage of the Cessna under massive drifts. Somewhere above the storm, the rhythmic beating of the rotor blades echoed off the Arrogech peaks, a phantom sound bouncing wildly through the jagged canyons. He couldn't see the helicopter, but he could feel the sonic vibration of its approach. It was close. It was flying incredibly low, likely dipping beneath the heavy cloud deck, just to maintain visual ground reference. Caleb tried to stand, but his legs simply refused to support his weight. The cold had severely compromised his motor functions. He collapsed into the thigh-deep snow, sinking instantly. He rolled onto his back, raising the heavy orange plastic of the flare gun toward the turbulent sky, with both shaking hands. His right thumb was completely numb, feeling like a block of dead wood attached to his hand. He couldn't feel the hammer. He shifted his grip using his left palm to awkwardly pull the hammer back until it locked with a stiff, metallic click. He aimed toward the loudest concentration of the rotor noise, hovering somewhere to the northeast, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. The firing mechanism was frozen solid. The moisture from the crash, the transition from the relatively warm bunker to the extreme Arctic cold, had frozen the firing pin securely in place. Despair, cold and absolute, finally washed over him. He was going to die right here, 50 yards from his dead pilot, holding a useless piece of orange plastic, while salvation hovered a mere 1,000 feet above him. The sound of the helicopter began to fade, moving away down the valley, continuing its blind grid search away from his position. "No," Caleb whispered. The wind violently snatched the word from his cracked lips. He brought the gun down to his chest. He didn't have time to carefully thaw it. He ripped off his right glove with his teeth, exposing his pale, frost-bitten hand to the lethal air. He wrapped his bare hand entirely around the metal firing mechanism of the flare gun, pressing it tightly against his chest, right over his pounding heart. He closed his eyes and forced himself to focus entirely on the weapon. He needed his body heat to transfer into the metal to melt the microscopic shard of ice jamming the pin. The cold of the gun seared his bare skin like a hot iron, an agonizing burn that made him clench his jaw until his teeth threatened to crack. 10 seconds. 20 seconds passed. The rotor sound was fading to a dull hum, almost completely lost, beneath the screaming wind. Caleb pulled the gun away from his chest. He didn't bother putting the glove back on. He wouldn't need it if this didn't work. He pointed the barrel back at the sky. He placed his bare thumb on the hammer, pulled it back, and yanked the trigger with all his might. Thwack-sosh! The recoil snapped his wrist backward. A blinding streak of crimson fire tore out of the barrel, ripping through the driving snow and rocketing hundreds of feet into the grey sky. The magnesium flare ignited with the intensity of a dying star, casting a brilliant, surreal red glow over the desolate tundra, illuminating the jagged peaks and the snow-buried wreckage of the Cessna in stark relief. It hung in the air for what felt like an absolute eternity, a burning beacon of human defiance against the complete indifference of the Arctic. Caleb dropped the gun. His energy was completely spent. The world began to shrink, narrowing down to a single pulsing point of light. The freezing wind no longer felt cold. It felt like a warm, heavy blanket settling over his frozen limbs. He closed his eyes finally, allowing the sheer exhaustion to take him. He didn't hear the sudden aggressive change in the pitch of the helicopter rotors as the pilot violently banked the aircraft toward the red streak in the sky. He didn't feel the massive downdraft of the blades as the Sikorsky HH-60 Pavey Hawk flared over the crash site, blasting the loose snow away from his prone body. The next sensation Caleb experienced was a sharp, piercing pain in his left shoulder, followed by a sudden rush of localized warmth. He forced his heavy eyelids open. A face was hovering above him, completely obscured by a dark visor and an olive-drab flight helmet. Thick gloved hands were moving rapidly over his chest, attaching a heavy steel harness. "I got him!" a voice yelled, distorted by a radio microphone, but easily audible over the deafening roar of the rotors. "Severe hypothermia, but we got a strong pulse. Let's get him on the winch now." A second figure, clad in high-visibility rescue gear, leaned down. The nameplate on his tactical vest read, "Wyatt." The man grabbed Caleb by the shoulders, his grip incredibly strong and reassuring in the blinding storm. "You're going home, buddy," Wyatt yelled directly into Caleb's ear, pulling him tight against his chest as the steel winch cable went taut. "Hell of a snow fort you built down there. Saved your damn life." As Caleb was hoisted into the turbulent air, spinning slowly beneath the belly of the helicopter, he looked down one last time. The red light of the flare was finally dying out, fading back into the relentless white of the Arctic storm. The ice bunker, his terrifying, freezing, miraculous savior, was already being erased by the blowing snow, vanishing back into the wild, as if it had never existed. He closed his eyes, the mechanical heat of the helicopter cabin finally washing over his frozen face, and allowed the darkness to take him, knowing this time he would wake up. Thank you so much for reading this incredible story of extreme Arctic survival. If Caleb's harrowing fight against the deadly 50-degree freeze kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling real-life survival dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you have known how to build a thermal ice bunker? Stay safe out there.